They say the First Legion is the Emperor's sword, the finest of his creations. But a sword is a cold, mindless thing, and after 10 years of service to the inner circle, I have come to realize that a blade does not choose what it cuts, it only feels the resistance of the bone. I am Brother Seraphon, and I am a ghost wearing the skin of a hero. Before they gave me the bone-white plate of the Deathwing, before they told me the truth that hollows out the soul, I was a creature of simple faith. I believed in the lion, I believed in the Emperor, and I believed that the shadows we walked in were meant to protect the weak. I was wrong. The shadows are not our shield, they are our cage. The memory that haunts me most is not my first battle, nor the day I received my black carapace. It is a memory of dust and silence on a world whose name has been scrubbed from every record. I remember a girl, no older than 12, standing amidst the ruins of a library. She had found a fragment of a vox-taped confession, words from a time before the Great Scouring. She didn't understand what she was holding, but she had seen the symbols of the First. I was commanded to ensure the secret remained buried. The bolt round didn't just end her life, it ended the person I was supposed to be. As her blood soaked into the parched earth, I didn't feel regret. I felt a cold, mechanical certainty. That was my true initiation. Everything that followed was merely a confirmation of my damnation. My journey into the heart of our legion's shame truly began on Tertius Majoris. It was a world of choking smog and endless industry, a planet-sized forge that had been infested by the green tide of the orcs. The sky was a bruised purple, occluded by the soot of 1,000 manufactorums. We were deployed to cleanse the northern hive spires. I was a line brother then. My power armor painted the deep, dark green of Caliban's lost forests. I moved with Tactical Squad Amdus, serving under a sergeant whose face was a map of scars and whose faith was as unyielding as the ceramite we wore. For weeks the war was pure. We fought the orcs in the narrow maintenance tunnels and across the high-altitude gantries. There is a terrible beauty in fighting the greenskin. They have no secrets, no hidden agendas. They live to kill, and we lived to stop them. I remember the smell of ozone and burnt promethium as we cleared level 88. My bolter was an extension of my arm, each shot a rhythmic pulse of divine wrath. Beside me, my brothers fought with the synchronized grace of a single organism. We were the Emperor's chosen, the hammers of his will. But on the 7th day of the siege, the purity ended. A storm raven, black as a void stalker, descended through the ash clouds, ignoring the tactical command net. It didn't carry reinforcements. It carried Interrogator Chaplain Asmodai. When he stepped onto the landing pad, the air seemed to grow heavy, as if the weight of his sins preceded him. His skull mask was a rictus of eternal judgment, and the rosarius on his chest glowed with a faint, sickly light. He didn't look at the war raging around us. He didn't care for the orcs or the hive's production quotas. He looked at me. Brother Seraphon, his voice a rasping growl through the vox grill. You have been watched. Your silence is noted. Your precision is required. Come. I followed him into the depths of a shattered cathedral dedicated to the machine god. There, amidst the ticking of ancient gears and the hiss of leaking steam, he told me the lie that sustains us. He spoke of Caliban, not as the paradise of our legends, but as the site of a betrayal that nearly tore the galaxy apart. He told me of Luther, the lion's own heart, turning his back on the light. He spoke of the fallen, our brothers, our blood, who had scattered into the warp like shards of a broken mirror. "We do not fight for the Emperor's glory alone, Seraphon," Asmodai whispered, his hand gripping my shoulder with enough force to dent the plate. "We fight for our existence. If the truth of our shame is ever revealed, the High Lords will brand us traitors. The Inquisition will burn our history. We are the first, and we must be the last to fall. You will hunt them, you will capture them, and you will ensure that no one, not the Guard, not the civilians, not even our fellow Astartes, ever learns what we are searching for." I looked into the empty eye sockets of his mask and realized that my life was no longer my own. I wasn't being invited into a circle of honor. I was being pulled into a conspiracy of silence. I swore the oaths that day, kneeling on the cold iron floor, while the sounds of the orc war cry echoed in the distance. I thought I was becoming a guardian of the Legion's soul. I didn't realize that to guard a secret that large, you first have to kill everything that makes you human. The green of my armor felt like a lie from the moment we descended into the bowels of the hive. I had been reassigned as support for the Raven Wing, the swift hunters who ride the wind of betrayal. My role was simple: containment. While the black-clad brothers on their screaming jet bikes tracked the scent of our ancient shame, I followed in their wake to ensure the world remained blind to what they found. We were no longer on the surface of Tertius Majoris, fighting for industrial quotas. We were in the gut, the sublevels where the light of the sun is a myth and the air is a soup of chemical waste and human despair. We were hunting a ghost named Zathaniel. To the logic of the inner circle, he was a cancer. To the reports I filed, he was a high-priority insurgent leader. But when we found him, the reality shattered the categories I had built to protect my sanity. He wasn't hiding in a fortress of spiked iron or leading a cult of star-worshipping madmen. He was in a chapel made of salvaged scrap, kneeling before an altar of rusted cogs. Around him, the wretched of the underhive, men and women whose skin was translucent from lack of light, muttered prayers for mercy. They didn't see a monster. They saw a saint who had shared their hunger. As we breached the heavy iron doors, the Raven Wings stepped aside to let Interroga Chaplain Asmodai pass. The steam from the overhead pipes hissed like a choir of snakes. Zathaniel didn't reach for a blade. He didn't even stand. He simply turned his head, his face a parchment of scars and thousand-year-old grief. His armor was a patchwork of ancient Mark IV plate and scavenged industrial plating, stripped of all insignia save for the scratches of penance. "I have waited for the dawn to find me," Zathaniel whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "But you bring only the night." Asmodai's response was the heavy thud of his Crozius Arcanum against the floor. "You bring the night, traitor. You carried it away from Caliban, and now you will bring it back to the rock." The old warrior looked past the chaplain, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no madness there, only a devastating lucid exhaustion. "Please," he pleaded, and for a second the transhuman mask of the Astartes slipped, revealing a man who had been running for an eternity. I have fought for the Emperor in the dark. I have slain his enemies where no one could see. If there is any scrap of the lion's honor left in you, kill me now. Do not take me to the silence. Do not let the interrogators erase the man I have tried to become. Asmodai struck him. The sound of the armored gauntlet hitting Zathaniel's jaw echoed through the vaulted chamber like a gunshot. You do not deserve the mercy of a quick death, the chaplain hissed. You deserve the truth, and truth is a fruit that only ripens in the dark, watered by your screams. The Deathwing Terminators moved in, their bone-white shapes looking like predatory statues in the gloom. They bound him in chains etched with suppression runes. Zathaniel didn't fight. He wept. It was a soft, hollow sound that made my skin crawl beneath my power suit. But the mission was not over. There were 3 of them. A woman with hands stained with grease, an old man who could barely stand, and a boy, perhaps 16, who still clutched a prayer book. They had seen the angels of the Emperor capture their saint. They had heard the word Caliban. They had seen the chaplain strike a giant they believed was divine. Asmodai turned to me. The red lenses of his skull helm glowed with a cold, predatory light. He didn't need to speak. The silence was the order. I drew my bolter pistol. My targeting reticle highlighted the woman's chest. Logic, witness elimination is paramount to chapter survival. I pulled the trigger. The roar of the bolter was deafening in the small chapel. The mass reactive shell turned her into a red mist before she could even scream. The old man tried to scramble away, his frail limbs clawing at the rust. My second shot took him in the spine, severing him with surgical precision. Then there was the boy. He fell to his knees, not to fight, but to beg. He spoke a dialect of the Underhive I barely understood, but the terror in his voice was universal. He looked at me, really looked at me, searching for the hero he had been told lived within the green armor. I didn't let him find it. I placed the barrel against his forehead. The metal was still hot from the previous shots. Click. The silence that followed was heavier than the smog of the planet. I stood over the bodies, the smoke from my weapon curling like a sacrificial offering. Asmodai walked over and placed a hand on my pauldron. It was a gesture of approval, but it felt like a brand. The secret is safe, Brother Seraphon. You have learned the weight of the crown we wear. It is made of the lead we put in the hearts of the innocent to save the many. We left them there, 3 nameless piles of meat in a forgotten chapel. As we ascended back to the light, I realized that I had split in 2. There was the warrior who followed orders, and there was the ghost that stood in that chapel, staring at the blood on the floor. The years that followed were a blur of similar shadows, planets burning, witnesses silenced, and the slow, agonizing realization that we weren't hunting the fallen to save the Legion. We were hunting them because we were afraid of what they might say if they were allowed to speak. Every time I cleaned my armor, I felt like I was trying to wash off the blood of the boy, but the stain was deeper than the ceramite. It was in the marrow. By the 9th year, the numbness had become my only true armor. My ceramite was still forest green, but in my mind I was already draped in the funeral shrouds of those I silenced. I had become a specialist in operational security, a title that sounded noble until you realized it meant being the man who pulls the trigger when the target is an ally. We were no longer fighting for the Imperium. We were fighting to keep the Imperium from looking too closely at us. I had watched research stations burn and orbital strikes turn refugee camps into glass, all to ensure that a single word, a single face, or a single ancient armor sigil never made it into a report. My name was spoken with respect in the halls of the Rock, but I felt like a man walking through a gallery of his own victims. The campaign on Gaia's Reach was where the mask began to crack. It was a feral world of towering forests and primitive tribes who worshipped the Emperor as a sun god. An orc splinter fleet had rained down upon the planet, and we were deployed alongside the Angels of Redemption, one of our successor chapters. They were our blood, our genetic cousins, yet even with them we were a fortress of secrets. I watched their captain, Uriel, lead his brothers into the thick of the orc horde with a ferocity that made even the First Legion look restrained. But while they fought for the survival of the world, we were listening to the whispers of the Ravenwing. We found the scent of a fallen named Thaladus in the northern highlands. The moment the signal was confirmed, our priorities shifted with a cold, mechanical ruthlessness. We abandoned the Angels of Redemption's eastern flank without a word of warning. We let an orc warband overrun a vital supply line because Thaladus was more important than the lives of our cousins or the fate of the planet. Captain Uriel's voice screamed over the Vox, demanding to know why the First Legion was retreating from a won battle. We gave him silence. We had a hunt to finish. Thaladus was not a warrior anymore. He was the Sky Father to a tribe of mountain dwellers. He had taught them how to forge better steel, how to irrigate their crops, and how to defend themselves against the beasts of the woods. When we arrived in our black and green gunships, the tribespeople didn't run. They stood in front of his cave with spears and rusted autoguns, ready to die for the giant who had given them a future. Thaladus himself stepped out, not wearing armor, but robes of animal hide. He looked at us and didn't raise a weapon. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same lucid despair I had seen in Zathaniel years before. "They are innocents," Thaladus shouted over the roar of our engines. "They know nothing of the warp or the betrayal. They only know I helped them live. Take me, but spare them." Interrogator Chaplain Asmodai, standing beside me on the ramp of the Thunderhawk, didn't even look at the man. He looked at the tribe. They have seen the face of the shamed. They have heard the Sky Father's stories. The rot is already in them. The order was given. I led my squad into the village. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. My bolter felt heavy, a leaden weight that I had to force myself to lift. I remember a woman throwing a spear at my chest. It clattered harmlessly off my power plate. I shot her in the throat. I remember a child hiding behind a grain basket. I didn't think, I only followed the programming. We killed 47 of them in 10 minutes. The mountain air, once crisp and cold, became thick with the smell of iron and copper. Thaladus screamed, a sound of such pure agony that it drowned out the bolter fire. He didn't scream for himself, but for the people he had tried to save. We dragged him away in chains, leaving the village a smoking graveyard. But as we reached the extraction point, the Angels of Redemption were waiting. Captain Uriel stood there, his split-colored armor splattered with orc blood, his power sword drawn. He looked at the chained prisoner, then at the burning village in the distance, and then at us. "You abandoned the front," Uriel hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that bordered on heresy. "You lost 100 brothers because you went hunting. What, a hermit?
You slaughtered a loyal Imperial tribe for a single man? Explain this, Dark Angel. Explain the honor of the First. Asmodai stepped forward, his skull mask inches from Uriel's face. The secrets of the First Legion are not for the eyes of the lesser, even those of our blood. Stand aside, cousin, or you will find that the lion's claws cut deeper than the orc's. For a heartbeat, the galaxy held its breath. Astartes stood against Astartes, fingers twitching on triggers. I looked at my brothers, then at the angels of redemption, and I realized we were more alone in that moment than any traitor in the warp. We were a brotherhood of the damned, willing to kill our own family to keep a lie alive. Uriel eventually stepped aside, but the look he gave me stayed with me. It wasn't hatred, it was pity. We called in an orbital strike to sanitize the mountain range, claiming the orcs had detonated a subgrid mine. As Gaia's reach burned from above, I sat in the darkness of the transport, watching Thalados weep in his cage. I realized then that the honor we were protecting was a corpse, and we were just the maggots keeping it from being buried. I was no longer a soldier. I was a janitor of the soul, sweeping the blood of the innocent under the rug of the Emperor's glory.
By the 10th year, my heart had become a tomb, and my soul was the silt at the bottom of it. I no longer prayed for victory. I only prayed for the silence to be absolute. I had become a master of the mask, a perfect hollow icon of the First Legion. The chaplains looked at my service record and saw a paragon of loyalty. I looked at my hands and saw the ghosts of every man, woman, and child I had erased to keep our secrets in the dark. I was being groomed for the inner circle, for the bone-white armor of the Deathwing. But first, the chapter required one last sacrifice of what remained of my conscience. We were sent to Sigma 77, a research station anchored to a dead star. It was a place of frozen shadows and cold logic, run by the Adeptus Mechanicus. They were studying temporal anomalies, tears in the fabric of time that leaked from the warp. We weren't there to help. We were there because one of those tears had spat out a ghost. His name was Gabriel. When we breached the station's central core, I expected a monster, a traitor hardened by millennia of hatred. Instead, I found a boy. He wore the ancient polished plate of the First Legion, but it was pristine, as if he had stepped off the fields of Caliban only yesterday. The warp had caught him in its teeth during the betrayal and thrown him 10,000 years forward into our laps. He was a fossil of innocence, a version of us from before the shame became our skin. "Brothers?" Gabriel asked, his voice shaking as he looked at our dark, scarred armor and the skull mask of Asmodai. "Is the war over? Did the lion triumph? Where is the Lord Luthor?" Asmodai didn't answer with words. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an executioner. But the tech priests of the station, led by Magos Deltrian, stepped between us. To them, Gabriel was a miracle, a living specimen of history. They didn't understand that to us, he was a living leak in a dam we had spent centuries building. "This individual is under the protection of the Omnissiah's covenant. He has provided invaluable data on the Caliban event. You cannot simply abduct a source of such logical significance." I saw the shift in Asmodai's posture. It was the same stillness that preceded the orbital strike on Gaia's reach. The logic of the First Legion supersedes the curiosity of the machine god, Asmodai whispered. You have heard things you cannot unlearn. You have looked into a sun that will blind you. The slaughter began with a single signal. We didn't just take Gabrielle, we erased the station. I remember hunting the junior adepts through the freezing corridors. They weren't soldiers, they were scholars, screaming in binary as our bolters turned them into scrap. I killed 12 of them in the main scriptorium. I watched the blood freeze as it hit the floor, turning into red crystals in the zero-gravity vents. We killed 93 souls that day, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of truth, died because that truth was inconvenient to our pride. As we dragged Gabriel toward the Thunderhawk, he looked at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a horror more profound than any I had seen in our enemies. You aren't the Lion's sons, he sobbed, his voice cracking. You are just ghosts. What did we do to you? What did we become? I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I had spoken, I would have had to admit that he was right. I watched as they bound him in the same chains we had used for Zathaniel and Thalitus. But Gabriel was different. He was the mirror. Looking at him, I realized that we hadn't just been protecting the secret for 10,000 years. We had been rotting around it. We scuttled the station, setting the reactor to overload. As the nuclear fire consumed the evidence of our visit, I stood in the chapel of our strike cruiser, staring at the statue of the lion. I felt a cold weight in my chest. I had done my duty. I had secured the secret. I was ready for my reward. But as I looked at the dark green of my armor, I realized I was already being buried. The bone-white plate wouldn't be an honor, it would be my shroud.
The summons came in the 10th year of my service to the Shadows. It did not come with fanfare, but with a silent nod from a chaplain whose name I did not know, a man whose armor was so encrusted with icons of penance that he looked like a walking tomb. I was to lead the mission to Penitent's Tier, a sliver of a moon orbiting a gas giant at the edge of the Segmentum Ultima. The objective was a high-value target, Zachariah. He was not just another stray soul. He had been one of Luther's inner circle, a man who had stood on the walls of Caliban while the world tore itself apart. To capture him was to capture a fragment of the betrayal itself. This was my final trial. If I succeeded, the bone-white armor of the Deathwing would be mine. We descended upon the moon like a nightmare. Penitent's Tier was a world of hushed winds and ancient stone, home to a single monastery of silent monks. We moved through the pre-dawn mist, our power armor dampened by stealth fields. The monks were shadows in the dark, innocent men who spent their lives polishing a shrine to a saint whose name had been forgotten by the rest of the galaxy. They had no idea that a monster lived among them. I entered the central chapel alone, as protocol demanded. The air smelled of beeswax and old parchment. Zachariah was there, kneeling before a simple altar. He wasn't wearing the warped plate of a traitor. He was dressed in the rough wool of a penitent. When he turned, his face was not twisted by the warp, but by a grief so profound it seemed to pull the light from the candles. "I knew the first would come," he said, his voice a dry whisper that carried no malice.
I have waited 10,000 years for the lion to send his hounds, but I see the hounds have become wolves. I raised my bolt pistol, the targeting reticle pulsing red over his heart. You are Zachariah. You will return to the rock. You will provide the names of your brothers. You will repent through the agony we provide. Zachariah laughed, a hollow sound that made the hairs on my neck rise. Repent, young brother? I have spent 10 millennia in repentance. I have built shrines on 100 worlds. I have saved lives where you have taken them. I realized the truth of our failure long before you were a spark in a gene vial. He stood up slowly, his hands open and empty. But you, I see the rot in you. You kill to protect a secret that has already hollowed you out. Tell me, if the lion returned tomorrow and saw what you have done in his name, the children you burned, the brothers you betrayed, the allies you slaughtered, would he call you his son, or would he see another monster to be put down? The words were sharper than a power sword. They cut through the layers of indoctrination and numbness I had built. I thought of the boy on Sigma 77. I thought of Gaia's reach. I realized then that Zachariah wasn't the one who needed saving. Please, Zachariah said, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying sincerity. I have given you everything I know through the Vox transmission I left in the altar's base. It is all there, the locations, the names, the patterns. Take it, but grant me the only thing I have left to ask for. Do not take me to the rock. Do not let them turn my silence into a weapon. Kill me here, in the light of the Emperor. The logic of my orders was clear. Capture was mandatory. The Deathwing required the living flesh for their rituals. But for the first time in 10 years, I did not care about the chapter's logic. I looked at this ancient man and saw the only honorable path left in a galaxy of lies. I didn't pull the trigger for the chapter. I didn't pull it for the lion. I pulled it for him. The bolt shell took him in the chest, ending his long exile in a flash of fire and blood. He died with a look of peace that I knew I would never possess. I did not stop there. I stepped out of the chapel and signaled my squads. The monks were waiting, confused and frightened. I told my brothers the target had resisted, that he had triggered a self-destruct, and then I gave the order to sanitize the site. I watched as we moved through the dormitory, executing the silent men in their beds. I did it personally, shot after shot, until the floor of the monastery was a river of red. I wasn't just killing witnesses anymore. I was killing the only people who had seen me commit a true act of mercy. I was burying my own soul alongside theirs. When we returned to the rock, I was hailed as a hero. I provided the data Zachariah had hidden, a treasure trove of intelligence that the librarians would spend decades unraveling. They did not question my report. Why would they? I was the perfect instrument. The elevation ceremony was held in the deepest sub-level of the rock, in a hall where the shadows themselves felt heavy. Grand Master Ezekiel placed the bone-white pauldrons upon my shoulders. The armor felt like a lead coffin. As the incense swirled and the ancient oaths were chanted, I looked into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. They call this armor bone white to represent the death we bring to our enemies. But as I stood there,
a knight of the inner circle, I realized the truth. It is the color of bone because we are already skeletons, walking corpses animated by a lie that will never let us rest. I am Brother Seraphon of the Deathwing. I wear the highest honors of the First Legion, and I am the greatest traitor of them all, for I have learned that the secret we guard is not that we fell, but that we are still falling. Tonight, as I sit in my private cell, I stare at the data slate I kept for myself, the one Zachariah whispered about at the very end. It contains a single coordinate and a phrase in a dialect of Caliban that hasn't been spoken in 10,000 years. The sleeper dreams of the sword, but the sword dreams of the throat. I look at my hands, and for a moment the bone-white ceramite seems to turn to dust. Someone is watching me from the shadows of the rock. I can feel a presence in the corridors, something older than the chapter, something that knows exactly what I did on Penitent's Tier. The hunt has not ended. It has only shifted its gaze, and I fear that I am no longer the hunter.